When people hear the phrase security architecture, they usually imagine soldiers, military vehicles, intelligence agencies, maybe even border patrols, and yeah, that's part of it. But security systems are actually much wider than that. They include logistics networks, food stability, communications infrastructure, energy reliability, regional diplomacy, and financial coordination. A country can have tanks and still be deeply insecure if food prices explode or if armed groups can move freely through neglected border regions. Africa has been dealing with this problem for decades. Conflicts in the Sahel, insurgencies in parts of Mozambique, instability in Sudan, military coups across West Africa, piracy near major shipping routes. These things do not happen in isolation. They usually grow inside weak systems where governments cannot respond quickly enough or consistently enough. And historically, a large portion of Africa's peacekeeping and stabilization funding came from outside of the continent, from European Union funding, United Nations frameworks, bilateral assistance from larger powers that created a strange situation where Africa often carried the human cost of conflict while external actors carried much of the financial machinery behind security responses. Did they create what they are now finding solutions for? We'll leave that for another video. But the issue with that arrangement is not only dependency itself, it's also timing. Outside funding systems move slowly because they are tied to approvals, political negotiations, donor conditions, reporting standards, diplomatic disagreements. Meanwhile, crisis moves quickly. A coup can happen in days. Food riots can emerge within weeks after inflation spikes. Armed groups adapt constantly. So there's always been this mismatch between the speed of instability and the speed of international bureaucracy. And that is partly why UN Security Council Resolution 2719 became important. It created a framework allowing African Union led peace operations to access UN assessed contributions more formally. I'm not going to lie, reading through the paperwork is boring, but the mechanics of the resolution acknowledges that African led missions require more predictable funding instead of constant emergency fundraising. Still, even that framework has limitations because the UN budget process itself can be slow and politically constrained. And African leaders know this very well, which is why the conversation this year started shifting away from can donors help toward how do we build financial systems that let African security operations move faster than the crisis itself. The Addis Ababa Accord reflects that broader shift. It's less about symbolism and more about institutional control, right? The African Union, the UN, and France all backing a framework where African led stabilization efforts gain more operational flexibility. Not in complete independence yet, obviously, but more room to maneuver financially and politically. And what is interesting is that private capital is entering the conversation too. That part surprises people sometimes because security discussions usually are framed purely around governments, right? But investors also care about stability. Mining firms care about protected transport corridors. Telecommunications companies care about stable electricity grids and functioning states. Agricultural exporters care about secure logistics routes. Banks care about political continuity. So the AU's discussions around security linked bonds and public private partnerships are really attempts to connect continental stability with long term commercial interest. Okay, so the logic is fairly straightforward. If instability destroys markets, then preventing instability becomes economically valuable. Of course, this creates comfortable questions too, because once private investors enter security financing, influence starts shifting. Of course, investors rarely fund such systems out of pure goodwill. So they expect predictability, they expect returns, they expect reduced risk around assets and trade corridors. So governments have to balance sovereignty carefully. A security architecture funded heavily through external donors creates one type of dependency, but a system shaped too aggressively around private financial incentives can create another one. Maybe going to be less visible, but it's still real. And Africa is entering this conversation during a period where the global system itself is fragmenting. Major powers increasingly prioritize their own regional interests first. Europe focuses on migration pressure and energy security. The United States focuses on strategic competition with China. China expands infrastructure and resource relationships across parts of Africa while protecting its own industrial interests more aggressively. Russia deepens selective military and political ties in certain regions. So, all of this means African governments cannot assume that external powers will stabilize the continent purely out of moral concern. Strategic interests always sit underneath the diplomacy somewhere, sometimes quietly, sometimes they are not quiet at all. What complicates this even further is that modern security is increasingly tied to infrastructure protection rather than traditional battlefield logic alone. So, pipelines, ports, undersea cables, rail corridors, fertilizer supply chains, power stations, satellite systems, these are now strategic assets, and Africa has many of them, or at least the raw materials feeding them. Cobalt from the I keep saying demographic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, uranium from Niger, platinum group metals from South Africa, major shipping relevance around the Cape Route and Red Sea access points. The problem is that protecting these systems requires long term institutional capacity, not just military spending. So you need intelligence coordination, you need functioning customs systems, anti corruption enforcement, reliable courts, regional diplomacy that survives election cycles. Even basic maintenance culture matters more than people think. Infrastructure collapses quietly long before states officially admit that there may be a crisis. And once infrastructure weakens, insecurity spreads outward from it. And then smuggling increases, armed groups exploit neglected regions, migration pressure rises, insurance costs increase, investors start to pull back. Governments then spend more reacting to instability than they would have spent preventing it earlier. That's partly why the AU's new approach feels different compared to older peacekeeping models. Right now, the conversation is no longer about emergency military deployments after violence explodes. It is shifting towards protecting the systems that prevent collapse in the first place, like the food systems, the energy systems, transport systems, digital systems, all of the systems. And honestly, private capital understands this logic very clearly because markets depend on continuity. A mining company investing billions into extraction infrastructure wants stable roads. They want stable ports and stable electricity. They want predictable security conditions and so on and so forth, and things of that nature. Telecommunications firms need protected data infrastructure. Agricultural exporters need functioning border logistics. So when investors discuss de risking Africa, they're really talking about reducing the unpredictability surrounding these systems. But then again, this introduces sovereignty tensions because whoever finances stabilization efforts often gains soft influence over strategic priorities, not necessarily through direct control. It's a little more subtle than that. It's usually through procurement standards and risk assessments and insurance frameworks and financing conditions and data access and technical dependencies. And over time, those layers accumulate into structural influence, whether governments fully notice it or not. Maybe they don't even care, I don't know at this point. And this is where Africa's challenge becomes less about whether it can technically fund parts of its own security architecture, and it becomes more about whether it can coordinate power across fragmented interests over long enough to even sustain one. And that one is harder. Some African states remain deeply connected to Western military partnerships. Others lean toward Russian security relationships. Others are running towards Chinese infrastructure financing. Regional organizations themselves sometimes compete quietly for influence and resources. Domestic politics complicates things further because leaders often prioritize short term political survival over long term institutional building. But still, there are signs of gradual movement. You've seen the joint military coordination, parts of Southern Africa, Continental Free Trade Area logistics planning, attempts to strengthen AU mediation structures, more conversations around local defense manufacturing and regional financing mechanisms. I mean, they may be slow processes, they are even uneven processes, but they are still processes. And maybe for now, that is the most important part. Security architectures are not built overnight. Europe's systems took generations. NATO evolved over decades. Gulf security arrangements evolved gradually too. Africa's version will probably emerge imperfectly through overlapping crises, trade corridors, pressures, energy competition, and infrastructure protection needs. And as these networks evolve, influence increasingly settles with the actors capable of maintaining continuity across systems that others depend on. Not just the states with the loudest speeches or the largest armies, but the institutions, the financiers, the logistics networks, and regional coalitions able to keep movement, trade, energy, communication, and stability functioning when pressure hits the system hardest. The trick right now is to keep things moving without being captured like the United States. And if Africa can build security, infrastructure, finance, and digital systems without handing permanent control to outside powers or local oligarchs, then maybe for the first time in a very long time, the continent negotiates with the world from leverage instead of dependence.